Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Hey, good morning, everybody. Okay, so we've been going through the chapter on the development of wisdom, and we've been working our way through the section on the different subjects that are to be contemplated in order to develop panya or prajna, wisdom. And so far we've gone through the 5 aggregates, the 6 or 12 sense bases, the elements, the 4 elements, the 18 elements, 6 elements, and last time we started the section on dependent origination. In Pali, this is paticca samuppada. Here the word paticca means having depended on, having relied upon, conditions. And upada, or samupada, means arising or origination. The prefix sam suggests the idea of complexity. And so this isn't just a simple arising, but it's a complex arising in which many elements depend upon other elements. Nothing exists independently, nothing arises from itself, but whatever arises in dependence on other things. And then the classical formulation of dependent origination that we meet again and again in the early discourses of the Buddha is in terms of a 12-facet sequence of origination, in which each of these 12 factors, or actually the first 11 factors, each of these 11 factors functions as the condition for the arising of the subsequent factor. Exactly how the condition functions as a condition for the dependent or originated factor, this varies in different ways. It depends on the particular 2 factors themselves. Sometimes the 2 factors originate simultaneously. So we have consciousness is a condition for nama-rupa, name and form. But also in some sutras we find name and form is a condition for consciousness. And so we say that the relationship of consciousness and name and form, we use the expression anya manya paccaya, which means mutuality conditions, mutual conditions. Each one supports the other. This is compared, actually we have an excellent example right here with this camera. It's based on a tripod. So each leg of the tripod stands based on the other two legs. If we break off one leg, what happens to the camera? It topples down to the ground. Because in order to stand, it needs three legs. So we could say two of the legs will be like nama-rupa, name and form. The third leg is like consciousness. So whenever consciousness arises, it originates along with itself, name and form, nama-rupa. Whenever name and form arises, it originates or brings into being along with it consciousness. Okay, but sometimes one condition will be a pre-existing condition for another phenomenon. For example, we have the 6 sense spaces. These are conditions for contact. The 6 sense spaces pre-exist. We have eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, mind. At least the 5 physical sense faculties pre-exist, and then contact arises when one or another of the sense faculties encounters some sense object. So we say that the 6 sense faculties, or at least the 5 physical sense faculties, are pre-existing conditions for contact. And contact arises subsequent to the 5 physical senses. These are just examples of how there are some differences in the way the conditions work. But the important factor, or the important consideration, is that whatever arises in this chain of conditions has to arise in dependence on some other condition. It can't arise by itself, can't arise independently, it doesn't arise just by chance, but it arises dependent upon something else. And so the Buddha teaches this chain of 12 conditions, because these 12 conditions, the way they're laid out in this way, show, I call this the causal dynamic that underlies the cycle of birth and death. So what the Buddha did on the night of his enlightenment, his task was to break out from the bondage to samsara, the cycle of birth and death. And so he had to investigate what is it that keeps the cycle turning, the wheel of becoming, what keeps the wheel in motion. And so he started to investigate from old age and death, which is the manifestation of suffering. Then he started tracing the chain of conditions back till he came to ignorance. But this doesn't mean that ignorance is an uncaused first cause of all samsara, but ignorance also arises based on conditions. Ignorance only arises based upon a previously existing body and mind. Ignorance exists because it's sustained by the other defilements. Ignorance continues to exist because it's associated with craving and clinging. So all of these factors are intertwined with one another. And so in order to, but the Buddha teaches that of all of the factors that maintain the cycle of birth and death, the most fundamental is ignorance. And that is why when the Buddha structures his path, the path unfolds and develops and culminates in panya, or wisdom. Because wisdom is that factor which is precisely the antidote, the remedy for ignorance. And so by developing panya, or wisdom, insight into the real nature of things, one gradually slices away at ignorance until when wisdom becomes fully developed, fully mature, then it completely breaks apart and dissolves ignorance, and then there arises what's called vidya, true knowledge, true understanding, and then based on this true knowledge, true understanding, comes vimukti, complete liberation. Okay, so last time I went through the 12 links in the chain of dependent origination, and we explained how the tradition, the explanatory tradition, arranges these 12 factors into 3 different groups depending on periods of time. Sometimes some modern Buddhists say a threefold division, that's Visuddhimagga, not the teaching of the Buddha. Visuddhimagga is a major commentary in the Theravada tradition. But actually one finds the threefold division of the 12 factors of dependent origination. It's not even exclusive to the Theravada school, but even the other Buddha schools that existed in India in ancient times also accepted this threefold way of dividing up the 12 factors. So this is part of the mainstream Buddhist understanding of dependent origination. One finds it in the Abhidharma Kosha, that's a major commentary of the Sarvastivada school. One finds it in Nagarjuna, in Madhyamaka Shastra, the treatise on the middle way. One finds it in the work of the Sangha, the commentator on the Yogacara school. So this is part of the common Buddhist heritage. Okay, so now we continue with the next section, or next passage. This is called, here I use the translation, stableness of the Dhamma. Okay, here the Buddha firstly announces that he's going to teach dependent origination and dependently arisen phenomena. So these are the 2 sides of the coin. Dependent origination, this points out how the condition or the cause gives rise to the dependent phenomena. And then the phenomena to which it gives rise is called the dependently arisen phenomena. So we have 2 words. I like them in Pali, they're both very important. So the word paccaya, that means condition. And then its counterpart is paccayupanna dhamma. This means the phenomena that arise dependent on the condition, or the dependently arisen phenomena. Okay, so the Buddha says, and what amongst this dependent origination, with birth as condition, aging and death comes to be. So here, aging and death is the paccayupanna dhamma. It's deep, in this case, it's the dependently arisen phenomena. Then the Buddha makes an important statement. Whether there is an arising of Tathagatas, that's fully enlightened Buddhas, or no arising of Tathagatas, that element still persists. The stableness of the Dhamma, the fixed course of the Dhamma, specific conditionality. This expression, specific conditionality, is pretty much means the same thing as dependent origination. A Tathagata awakens to this, becomes enlightened to this, and breaks through to it. That is, gains a direct understanding of it. Having done so, he explains it teaches it, proclaims it, establishes it, discloses it, analyzes it, and elucidates it. And he says, see, with birth as condition, aging and death arises, or old age and death occur. Okay, so this statement, in this statement the Buddha is emphasizing that this is a fixed and invariable law of the universe. It's not something that the Buddha himself has created. But it's something that the Buddha discovers. And he calls this, he uses the expression, Dhammatitata. Which means literally the standingness of the Dhamma. But I translate it more freely as the stableness of the Dhamma. It's something which is fixed, invariable, ever occurring. And so the specific function of a Tathagata, of a Buddha, is not to create this law, but what the Buddha does, what constitutes his awakening or his enlightenment, is that he discovers this law. We could say he uncovers it by removing the screens of ignorance that cover it over. And in this way he breaks through to it. Abhisammeti. He makes the breakthrough to this principle. And then he teaches and proclaims it to the world. Okay, then the same thing is said with regard to all of the other links in this formula, down to with ignorance as condition, volitional formation occur. Okay, then in the concluding statement, he says, thus monks, the actuality in this, the inerrancy, that it's something that occurs without fail, without any failure, the invariability, the specific conditionality in this, that one thing is the specific condition for something else. This is called dependent origination. You could see how strongly the Buddha is emphasizing this principle. Like this principle is the key to understand what the Buddha became enlightened to. At least it's one side of the Buddha's enlightenment. Okay, then the Buddha teaches what are, or he raises the question, what are the dependently arisen phenomena? And then he gives the answer. Aging and death is impermanent, conditioned, dependently arisen. Because it's dependently arisen, it's subject to destruction, vanishing, fading away, and cessation. That is, it's possible to make an end of aging and death by eliminating its condition. Birth is impermanent, existence is impermanent, clinging, craving, all the way back to ignorance is impermanent, conditioned, dependently arisen. Because it's dependently arisen, it's subject to destruction, vanishing, fading away, and cessation. It's possible to make an end of ignorance. So this is called the dependent, or these are called the dependently arisen phenomena. Okay, then the Buddha says, when a noble disciple has clearly seen with correct wisdom, as it really is, this dependent origination and these dependently arisen phenomena, it is impossible that he will run back into the past thinking, did I exist in the past? Didn't I exist in the past? And so on. What was I in the past? How was I in the past? Having been what did I become in the past? Or that he will run forward into the future, thinking, will I exist in the future? Won't I exist in the future? How will I be? What will I be in the future? How will I be in the future? Having been what will I become in the future? Or that he will be inwardly confused about his present existence, thinking, do I exist? Do I not exist? What am I? How am I? Where have I come from? Where will I go? And what is the reason for this? Because this noble disciple has clearly seen with correct wisdom this dependent origination and these dependently arisen phenomena. Yeah, I can see two ways in which this whole passage can be understood. There be two ways to interpret it. One way, first, what do all of these questions revolve around? What is the center point of all of these questions? Right, exactly. The I, the sense of self. Okay, so what happens when one sees dependent origination and dependently arisen phenomena is that this insight into this process of conditionality eliminates the view of self. Because one sees that what one has been identifying as I, taking to be a self, is really just, so to say, the idea of self that one has been holding and grasping to is just an illusion or a delusion which has been built up on the basis of dependently arisen phenomena, on this process of dependent origination. So the process of dependent origination is actually working within the five aggregates. And so these five aggregates are all dependently arisen phenomena. And in turn, they are the conditions which are sustaining dependent origination. Thus, when one sees with insight the process of dependent origination within one's own experience, how consciousness arises from contact between sense faculty and objects, how consciousness, name and form, work together as mutuality conditions, how one can't exist without the other, then this view, this precise view of the dependent origination of all of these bodily and mental phenomena show that there's no truly existing, no substantial self within this compound of dependent phenomena. And so when the view of self drops away, then all of these questions that revolve around the question of self, what was I in the past, what will I be in the future, what am I now, do I exist now, all of those questions become meaningless. Maybe it's a little bit like they drag a man into court, or maybe into the police station. He has 5 tough policemen standing in front of him and saying, do you beat your wife? Do you not beat your wife? How do you beat your wife? What kind of instrument do you use when you beat your wife? And the man is sitting there silent. But then finally, when the policeman stops questioning him, he says, but I'm not married. So then all of their questions become meaningless. Because that condition on which they have meaning, that condition that gives meaning to the question is absent. Okay, so this is one way which to understand this passage. The other way in which it can be understood is that all of these questions arise for somebody who doesn't see dependent origination. But when he sees dependent origination, then he'll know that even though there's no self existing in the past, but there was this complex of conditions in the past, that complex, or that bundle of conditions, flowing together of conditions in the past, brought into being this bundle of conditions now that I refer to as myself, and any activities backed by ignorance and craving that I indulge in this present life, this will bring into being a bundle of conditions in the future, part of the same flow or stream of becoming. And so by understanding the causal relationships between the conditions of the past, the conditions of the present, and the dependent phenomena of the future, then one can understand the relationship between past, present, and future. And so one doesn't have to be obsessed by these questions. Okay, let's go on to the next passage. This is called 44 Cases of Knowledge. So this is going to show the kind of knowledge that the disciple has to obtain when investigating dependent origination. So first one has knowledge of aging and death, knowledge of its origin, knowledge of its cessation, knowledge of the way leading to its cessation. So this is 4 types of knowledge. Then one goes all the way back to knowledge of volitional formations, knowledge of their origin, knowledge of their cessation, knowledge of the way leading to their cessation. So we have 11 factors taken in 4 ways. So we have 44 cases of knowledge. Why isn't ignorance mentioned? It's true, but a little more specifically.
It's the opposite of knowledge.
Yeah, but we've gone back in the chain of conditions, back to the volitional formation.
Even when a person already knows the 44 knowledges, there is no more category.
Well, we would say when he has these 44 knowledges, there's maybe no more craving either, but craving is mentioned.
Because our ignorance then also exists independently upon other factors. So it has to be in the relationship. So cannot be isolated as a factor by itself.
Of course, if one mentioned ignorance, then one would have to give conditions for ignorance. But why isn't it mentioned here?
Implicitly explained it's already. Implicitly it's explained in the 44 knowledge already.
Where?
With the cessation of religion, that will be the cessation of ignorance. So it's implied.
Yeah, I think you're getting very hot, but you didn't say exactly what I wanted to hear.
And I have another approach to the answer is ignorance is not the object of knowledge.
No, it is. No. But you came very close with the first answer.
Well, is knowledge of the origin of origination. The knowledge of the origin of universal formation is the knowledge of ignorance.
Exactly, that's what I wanted to hear. That ignorance, in fact, is mentioned, even though it's not stated in this formula, but it's mentioned when you have the knowledge of the origin of volitional formation. That is ignorance. In fact, because the text is abbreviated, you don't see it, but in the full version of the text, it will raise a question as it goes along. What is the volitional formation? Then it will define them. Then what is the origin of volitional formation? Then it will say, with ignorance as condition, the volitional formations arise. So ignorance will be mentioned. And then one could also raise the question, what is the condition for ignorance? So ignorance is a conditioned phenomena. Then different texts give, sometimes they raise that question, they give different answers. Okay, so anyway, first the Buddha states in the general way the 44 cases of knowledge, then he gives a more elaborate development. He takes each factor, he takes the definition, then how it arises, how it ceases, and then the Noble Eightfold Path is always explained as the way to the cessation of aging and death, cessation of birth, cessation of becoming, and so on, all the way back to the cessation of volitional formation. Okay, then we're going to have within this 44 types of knowledge, 2 types of knowledge are going to be distinguished. First, the Buddha says here, when a noble disciple thus understands aging and death, its origin, its cessation, and the way leading to its cessation, this is his knowledge of the principle. Actually, the Pali word here that's translated as principle is the word Dhamma. So it's Dhamme Jnana. It's knowledge of the Dhamma, knowledge of the essential principle. Okay, then the Buddha says, by means of this principle, and again it's the word Dhamma, this principle that is seen, understood, immediately attained, or immediately penetrated, fathomed, he applies the method to the past and the future. So now we're going to see how, based upon this immediately visible knowledge of the dependent relationship between these factors, he can then take this principle and extend it back to the past and forward to the future. So then one gains the knowledge, whatever ascetics and Brahmins in the past directly knew aging and death, its origin, its cessation, and the way leading to its cessation, all these directly knew it in the very same way that I do now. This is the kind of certainty that one has, that any meditators or contemplators in the past, whether 1 century ago, 10 centuries ago, 100 centuries ago, different world systems, wherever they understand aging and death, they understand that aging and death originate from birth. Then, in the future too, whatever ascetics and Brahmins in the future will directly know aging and death, its origin, its cessation, and the way leading to its cessation, all these will directly know it in the very same way that I do now. So this is not a direct knowledge. The direct knowledge is the knowledge of how the conditioned phenomena arises from its condition, how the conditioned phenomena ceases through the ceasing of its condition, and how the Noble Eightfold Path is the way to the cessation. But this is called knowledge of entailment, or maybe we can call it an inferential knowledge. In Pali, it's Anvaya Jnana. So the knowledge of the principle, the knowledge of the law, one could say, the knowledge of this invariable, universal law, that is Dhamme Jnana, the knowledge that one sees directly. But then what is called here or translated as knowledge of entailment, this is Anvaya Jnana. The word Anvaya comes from the prefix anu, which has the sense of accompanying or following, and aya is going. So this is the knowledge which goes after, the knowledge which follows. Okay, then the Buddha says that when a noble disciple has purified and cleansed these two kinds of knowledge, knowledge of the principle and knowledge of entailment, he is then called a noble disciple who is accomplished in view, accomplished in vision, who has arrived at this true Dhamma, who sees this true Dhamma, who possesses a trainee's knowledge, a trainee's true knowledge. I'll explain these terms in a moment. Who has entered the stream of the Dhamma, a noble one with penetrative wisdom, one who stands squarely before the door to the deathless. So these two knowledges, these are called the knowledges of a trainee. The technical word is seika. Okay, so the seika, this is a disciple who stands at the level of the first one or another of the first three stages of enlightenment. Either the stream enterer, once returner, non-returner. He's called the trainee because he still has to follow through with the training. This is Yoshue. Okay, so this is the distinctive knowledge of the trainee, one who has gotten the vision of the Dhamma, the definitive insight into the Dhamma, but not yet reached the end of the path. But the trainee uses this vision, uses this insight, develops this understanding, and as he develops this understanding, he comes to the end, to the final realization. And so it's called the trainee's knowledge, seika jnana, I think, the trainee's true knowledge, seika bija, one who has entered the stream of the Dhamma. That indicates that this one has become at least a stream enterer. He's in the stream of the Dhamma, and it's just that the flow of the Dhamma will now carry him along to final realization. Then a noble one with penetrative wisdom, who stands squarely at the door to the deathless. He hasn't yet entered the door, but this is Amitadvarang Ahachatipati. He's standing at the door, just like when you go to visit a friend's house, you arrive, you're at the door, you ring the bell, then it's just a matter that your friend comes and opens the door and you can come into the house. So he's the door to the deathless. He's already knocked and just waiting for the door to open. Okay, maybe before I go, I'll ask whether there's any questions at this point. Bodhi has a question. Where is that from? Oh, you have it already.
For the stream enter, is the door open already, or the door is not open? Because you just knocked the door. I know it's a metaphor, but I just want to know, because when the door is open, he has realized Nibbana, that I remember last time you told me a surrender has to experience Nibbana.
Yeah.
So then the door is open. I just want to have this point clarified.
Okay.
That there's a surrender experience Nibbana or not.
Okay, that's a good way to follow up the simile. Better than my own. He's standing in front of the door. The door is open, so he can see inside. He's already seen inside the door. But he hasn't yet entered into the door. He hasn't yet entered through the door into the house.
And that is called experiencing. Experiencing the Nibbana already.
Yeah.
And then he hasn't stepped inside.
He hasn't stepped inside yet.
And
but let's not take metaphors too literally and then try and push them to the limit. And factually, the stream enterer has experienced Nibbana, but he hasn't yet reached the point where he's constantly dwelling in a Nibbanic state.
Is there a difference between to experience and to attain, or to?
I would phrase that as a difference. So that we would say that the stream enterer experiences it, has experienced it through this momentary meditative experience of attainment. And then it's said, the commentaries say that he could even enter a special meditative attainment where he'll experience it continuously during the period of that meditation. But he hasn't reached Nibbana in the sense of the destruction of greed, hatred, and delusion. That is unique to the Arahant.
Even momentarily, he does not experience the essence of delusion, anger, and...
Well, I would say that in that momentary experience, one experiences the destruction of greed, hatred, and delusion, but they're not actually fully destroyed.
Thank you.
I think this will become a little clearer as we go along.
Maybe it's the question of the semantics, but the last paragraph we talked about a noble disciple. When a noble disciple has purified and cleansed these two kinds of knowledge, then he's at the door of the breakthrough. But don't we call a disciple a noble disciple after the disciple reaches the breakthrough? And I ask the question because, is there a difference between seeing dependent origination and seeing Nibbana?
Actually, there's two questions here. First, I think the expression noble disciple Arya Savaka is not restricted in use to somebody who's a stream enterer or higher. But I think it's sometimes given a wider application. So it could mean a disciple, even one who is practicing earnestly, who has the right view and engaged in right practice. So at that point, I think the expression Arya Savaka, noble disciple, would apply. But here, definitely, the noble disciple is one who is at least a stream enterer, because it said he is one who has entered the stream of the Dhamma, and he has the seka, the true knowledge of one in training. So that's unique to somebody who is at least stream enterer, if not once returner, non-returner. Correct? Okay.
Maybe my understanding of English is flawed here. Because I thought if there's a noble disciple who has purified sanctity to knowledge, then there must be noble disciple who has not purified sanctity to knowledge.
Yeah, one could say that, yeah.
Then who are they? They are noble disciples. Like you said, in this context.
Yeah, I would take them to be noble disciples in this broad sense. Not noble persons in the sense of Arya Pugala, in the sense of those who are reached the stage of the noble ones. But the word Arya Savaka is sometimes used in a broader sense, not in a very specific technical sense. So one who is engaged in trying to purify these two knowledges would also be called a noble disciple.
Have they seen dependent origination?
Let us say that they're investigating dependent origination. Okay, now this will bring us to your second question. The way I understand it, one can be investigating dependent origination and seeing relationships in the chain of conditions, in this way gaining an understanding of dependent origination in the sequence of arising, without yet being a stream enterer. This would be the investigations that are undertaken by one who is preparing for the attainment of stream entry. So one is investigating the chain of origination, the chain of conditions that produce the resultant phenomena. But it's when one makes a breakthrough to that realization or that momentary experience of Nibbana, the seeing of Nibbana, that one then sees Nibbana as the ultimate cessation of all the factors of dependent origination. And then one has the knowledge of the cessation side of dependent origination. So this is maybe like first, let's see, there's a statement that comes. First, there comes Sammapitijnana. First there comes the knowledge of the stableness of the principles, and afterwards the knowledge of Nibbana. So first one investigates dependent origination and the sequence of arising, and then when the insights and the wisdom is mature, then one breaks through to this experience of Nibbana, and then that it doesn't bring yet the complete cessation of the chain of conditions, but one sees how ignorance can cease, craving can cease, and with their cessation, all of the phenomena that arise on account of them will cease. So in this way one sees the cessation side of dependent origination.
But it's amazing how can one see the arising side and other see the cessation side simultaneously?
What I would understand is that one doesn't see the cessation side yet simultaneously, but one will have a kind of inferential knowledge that when the cause ceases, the effect will cease. But it's purely inferential. One hasn't yet actually seen the cessation.
How about the state right before the breakthrough? The person is still a noble one already because there are 4 pairs of people.
Yeah.
So is that in the broad sense or just in the strict the narrow sense? I consider it in the narrow sense that the state right before the breakthrough is also called a noble one.
Yeah.
So for that person, the person does not experience the sensation side of dependent origination, but he does experience the arising side of dependent origination.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I didn't bring that person in order to avoid making things too complicated. Any other questions now? Or should we go on? Okay, let us go on then to the next. Okay, this is an important aspect of the teaching of dependent origination. Well, let's say it's an important philosophical aspect of dependent origination. We know that the Buddha taught the Noble Eightfold Path as the middle way, or the middle practice. It's called Majjhima Patipanta, the Noble Eightfold Path, because it avoids two extreme ways of practice. The way of hedonistic indulgence and sense pleasures, and the way of extreme ascetic practice, self-mortification. Okay, so corresponding to the Buddha's middle way of practice, the Buddha also taught a middle view, or we call this the view of the middle way, and this is dependent origination. And it's called the middle way of understanding, or the middle view, because it avoids two extreme views that were existing in the Buddha's time. One is the view of eternalism. This is in Pali, this is called Sattva Vada. Sattva Vada, eternalism, is the view that there's some kind of eternal essence in the human being and in the universe. In other words, something like a permanent soul, a permanent self within the individual living being. And then behind the universe there's some kind of eternal, substantial reality. Like in the Buddha's time, there was a belief amongst some of the Brahmins that there's something called Brahma, which is the eternal ground of the universe. So everything originates from Brahma, and everything returns to Brahma. Brahma is the one universal permanent reality. And then within the individual there is the permanent self called the Atman. And then the ultimate teaching of Brahmanism is that the Atman and Brahma are the same. They're one reality. That's one form of eternalism. There were different forms of eternalism. Another would be theism, the idea that there is an eternal, everlasting, personal God who creates the universe, and everything within the universe arises and passes, but the eternal God, or God, remains for eternity. And God plants within the living being the individual soul, and the individual soul lasts for eternity. Okay, so this is the eternalist view. And then the other view is called Ucheda Vada. Ucheda means, the word Ucheda means literally cutting off. And so this is translated as the annihilationist view. This is the view that at death, well, it's the view that the person doesn't have any kind of permanent self. The person is ultimately reducible just to the physical body, or even if there's a mind independent of the body, but everything comes to an end at death. That there's no survival, no continuation beyond death. But when death takes place, it's the complete end of the individual's existence. Then the Buddha calls dependent origination, he calls it Majjhima Dhamma. That is the Dhamma which goes in the middle. Because dependent origination, it goes in the middle because it avoids the mistakes of the two extreme views. It avoids the mistakes of the eternalist view because it doesn't propose that there's some eternal reality, some substantial reality underlying the universe, or some substantial reality within the individual person, a permanent self. And so in this way it avoids the view of eternalism, but also it avoids the view of annihilationism, because it teaches that as long as these conditions remain operative, our individual life doesn't come to the end of death, but life will continue on in new forms depending on conditions. Okay, so in this sutra, in section D, a monk by the name of Aggregates comes to the Buddha and says, "Venerable Sir, it is said, right view, samadhi. In what way, Venerable Sir, is there right view?" Then the Buddha says, "The world, for the most part, depends upon a duality." These are the two extreme views upon the idea of existence. Here the idea of existence means eternalism, the view that there exists some kind of eternal substance, either a substance behind the universe, or a substance within the person, the permanent self, or the idea of non-existence. The idea of non-existence, it doesn't mean that the world doesn't exist at all, but it's the idea that at death we become completely non-existent, that there's just annihilation of the person at death. But the Buddha says, for one who sees the origin of the world as it really is with correct wisdom, there is no idea of non-existence in regard to the world. That is, when one sees the process of dependent origination, how the conditions produce their results, how as long as the conditions operate, there will be new existence over and over again, then one doesn't subscribe to the idea of non-existence or annihilation in regard to the world, which means to our own life. But for one who sees the cessation of the world as it really is with correct wisdom, that is, when one sees how all of the phenomena that make up body and mind undergo cessation, that they pass away, then there is no idea of existence, of eternal existence, in regard to the world. Then the Buddha says, the world is for the most part shackled by engagement, it's attachment, clinging, and adherence. These are all different words meaning the same thing as grasping or attachment. But for this one with right view does not become engaged and cling to that engagement and clinging. Maybe this is translated too literally, following the Indian style of expression. Okay, this one does not become engaged and cling, and does not take up that mental standpoint, adherence, underlying tendency. He does not take a stand upon the idea of myself. That is basically the pivot on which these two views of eternalism and annihilationism stand. The idea, myself. If one holds myself is eternal, I have a true self that's eternal, that's eternalism. If one thinks myself is just something physical, material, destroyed when the body passes away, then one falls into annihilationism. So he has no perplexity that what arises is only, you have to say, suffering arising. What ceases is only suffering ceasing. maybe here translating dukkha as suffering is not so, shouldn't be taken too literally. It doesn't mean that what arises is only misery, grief, sorrow, worry, distress. I mean, that is there too, but the statement doesn't mean that the only thing that arises in life is experienced misery and grief. But the word here is dukkha. And so the sense of dukkha here is that whatever arises is ultimately unsatisfactory because it's conditioned, impermanent, bound to pass away. And whatever ceases is only dukkha ceasing. So basically it's referring to the 5 aggregates that make up the individual person. So these 5 aggregates, in the first teaching of the first sermon, the Buddha says, in brief, it is the 5 aggregates of clinging, that is dukkha, the noble truth of suffering. So it is these 5 aggregates that we identify as I, me, myself. That is what is really there. And when the view of self falls away, then one sees that there are just these 5 aggregates arising through conditions, ceasing through conditions. And so then one gains this right view. So then Buddha says, his knowledge about this is independent of others. It is in this way that there is right view. Then all exists. This is eternalism. That's one extreme. All does not exist. This is the second extreme. And without veering towards either of these extremes, the Tathagata, the Buddha, teaches the Dhamma by the middle. This is Majjhima Dhammang Deseti. Then we have the chain of dependent origination. Okay, I'll go on to the next passage. Okay, this is quite a difficult passage. But we'll read it and try to investigate it. Okay. Monks, what one intends and what one plans and whatever one has a tendency towards, this becomes a basis for the continuance of consciousness. I want to write these 3 words, very important words, on the board. Okay, what one intends, this is yang cheteti, and what one plans, yang pakapeti. And whatever one has a tendency towards, this is a rather clumsy English way to render what's very concise in Pali, yang anuseti. Okay, now the verb intends, cheteti. This is the verb from which is derived the noun chetana. Chetana means volition. And chetana is the main factor in the sankharas. So in the usual formula of dependent origination, where we have volitional formations, sankhara, the principal factor in those volitional formations is chetana, volition. And so when we see the word what one intends, yang cheteti, it implies chetana, volition, and that implies the sankharas. the volitional formation. The verb pakapeti is very similar. It's just really a synonym for cheteti. So we don't have to say anything further about that. Then the word anuseti, what one has a tendency towards. This verb implies the noun anusaya. Anusaya means literally sleeping along with, and it refers to the underlying tendencies towards the defilement, towards certain defilements. Okay, so the underlying tendencies, what are the chief underlying tendencies? We could say that two of them mentioned in the text are the underlying tendencies to ignorance and to craving. Okay, so what one intends, what one plans, and whatever one has a tendency towards, that statement implies the presence of the sankharas along with ignorance and craving. And then this becomes a basis for the continuation of consciousness. So what sustains the forward movements of consciousness from life to life is the driving force of the volitional formations and the underlying tendencies to ignorance and craving. And so, taken together, the underlying tendencies and the volitional formations, these function as a basis for consciousness to continue. So when there is a basis, there is a support for the establishing of consciousness. In other words, consciousness breaking off from its base in one life, its connection with the body, psychophysical organism, in one life, when consciousness departs, as long as it's sustained by ignorance and craving, driven by the volitional formations, it finds some support for arising again in a new life form. Then when consciousness becomes established and starts to grow, then there is the production of future renewed existence. That is, once consciousness gets established in the new life, then it brings along with it, or it gives rise to, all of the other factors essential to that new life. It gives rise to, in other words, to name and form. And so then the new life starts to develop, to evolve. And so when there is the production of future renewed existence, then there comes future birth, aging and death, sorrow, lamentation, pain, dejection, and despair. So that is the origin of this whole mass of suffering. Okay, then the second passage says, if, monks, one does not intend and does not plan, but still has a tendency towards something, this becomes a basis for the continuation of consciousness. Actually, the commentary explains that this paragraph here refers to a situation that we never really find, because it's not possible to stop intending. But the text includes this passage simply to emphasize that the most important function is that of the underlying tendencies. rather than the volitional formation. Okay, then the third paragraph. When one does not intend and does not plan and does not have a tendency towards anything, that is when the anusayas, the underlying tendencies, are removed, when one does not will anything, intend or plan in ways that are governed by the defiled tendencies, then there is no basis for the continuation of consciousness. When there's no basis, there is no support for the establishing of consciousness. Consciousness doesn't find anything, any way to become established in a new existence. When consciousness is unestablished and does not come to growth, there is no production of future renewed existence. And when there is no production of future renewed existence, then there is no future birth, aging and death, sorrow, limitation, pain, dejection, and despair. So that is the cessation of this whole mass of suffering. Okay, then I'll just take quickly the last paragraph, then I'll ask the question. Okay, I included this last paragraph here in the book because this gives us an interesting variation on the usual formula of dependent origination. This passage will show us how instead of starting from ignorance, going from ignorance to the volitional formations, from volitional formations to consciousness, and then drawing things out from consciousness, this passage, it seems to change the sequence so that here, to explain the origin of the world, the Buddha begins with the 6 sense bases. Okay, we start with the eye. We have the eye and forms. So the eye and forms are pre-existing conditions for the arising of consciousness. So the eye exists, forms exist. When forms impinge on the eye, then this gives rise to eye consciousness, a kind of consciousness that has the function of seeing the form. Then this meeting of the three, that is the meeting of eye, forms, and consciousness, this is what is called contact. But the way I understand this meeting, the way I would express it, I would say that consciousness meets the object, form, through the eye. So the eye it's like when two people who haven't met each other before, there's the third person who knows both of them. You say, John, I want you to meet James. James, meet John. So the third person is the one who introduces the middleman between the two. So the middleman here is the eye. The eye introduces forms to consciousness or introduces consciousness to the forms. And so when consciousness meets the forms through the eye, or when the forms enter the range of consciousness through the eye, we call this contact. Then with contact as condition, there's feeling. Feeling is condition, craving, clinging, becoming, birth, then aging and death, sorrow, limitation, pain, dejection, and despair. That's the origin of the world. Then the same is said with regard to each of the other sense faculties. Okay, now, what is the passing away of the world, or the ceasing of the world? Okay, we start with the world, things in the world, in the same way. We have the I and forms. Based on them, I consciousness arises. The meeting of the three is contact. With contact as condition, feeling comes to be. With feeling as condition, craving arises. So craving is the pivot here. If one allows that craving to continue, it turns into clinging. If clinging continues, it gives rise to the activities that make up becoming. And then those activities will project into a new form of existence, starting with birth, continuing through growth till old age and death. But now, feeling tends to originate or to provoke craving. But instead of flowing along with that craving, if one stops the craving, then with the remainderless fading away and cessation of that craving comes cessation of clinging. What this means in practice is that instead of flowing along with the craving, one applies mindfulness and clear comprehension to the six sense bases. And so when one sees forms, hears sounds, smells odors, experiences tastes, and so on, applying mindfulness and clear comprehension, one creates space and opening for wisdom to operate. Through wisdom, one investigates form, sound, smell, taste, and sees whatever one experiences is impermanent. It arises and passes. Because it arises and passes, it's dukkha, not satisfactory. Because it's not satisfactory, because it's impermanent, not satisfactory, it's not self, not worth clinging to. And so, through this insight into impermanence, into dukkha or suffering, one stops clinging, or one stops craving, one cuts off the craving. And so when craving gets blocked and cut off, clinging stops. When clinging stops, then one no longer starts through one's activities building up a new existence. When there's no new existence, there's no birth, no aging, no death. And so that is the passing away or cessation of the world. Okay, so this brings us to the end of the section on dependent origination. Okay, so now if there's any questions, then please feel welcome to ask. Please take the microphone. I'm not sure whether it's on.
I kind of wonder, consciousness, where is the consciousness? You know, like we have, six senses to understand eyes, nose, ears, mouth. Where is consciousness located in our bodies?
Consciousness itself is not located in a specific point, but there's some difference of opinion, like what is the base for consciousness? The early Buddhist texts don't say anything about a physical base for consciousness. But the Indian commentators always say that the base for consciousness is the heart. They speak about the heart base as the base for consciousness. Now, some modern scientists, sometimes they say the brain is the base for consciousness. And so we come to this dispute, which is the base for consciousness? Is it the heart or the brain? In my experience, it's the heart. This is the way I understand the relationship between them. I use an analogy of a computer. The central processing unit for the computer, in the computer is the central processing unit that is the part of the computer that processes all the data. Right? Somebody who does hardware. You do hardware? No? Anyway, we'll say, just for argument's sake, that it's the central processing unit that processes all the data, that performs all of the operations. You do a find and change operation, change the word blue to red in a document, and all of this goes through the central processing unit, and it makes the change. And so one might think that the central processing unit is the core or the essence of the computer. But if power is cut off, the central processing unit doesn't work. It only works when there's electric power. And so you could say that electric power is really the heart or essence in the operation of the computer. That is really what fuels the computer's cognitive capacities. So the way I understand it, the place where consciousness originates, it's not the physical heart, not the organ which beats like this, but in this area there is a very, very subtle type of material substance, not the kind of material substance that one can see with the eyes if one cuts open the body. And it's that, maybe we could call it a field, a kind of field which operates within a living body, which is based here. And it's here that consciousness originates, and it flows up to the brain, and then it's the brain that performs the cognitive operations, like the central processing unit. But what happens when somebody becomes brain dead, when all of the functions of the brain cease, except the medulla oblongata to sustain life? Okay, when the cerebral cortex and the cerebellum, if they die, then the living being can't perform any cognitive operations, and they'll never again be able to perform any kind of cognitive operations. But what happens, you don't say that consciousness has been completely destroyed, but the consciousness is just receded to the area of the heart, and as long as life remains, the consciousness will remain in the subconscious flow in the area of the heart. Then when life is cut off, then the consciousness no longer functions based on the heart. And then the consciousness will leave the body and migrate elsewhere to continue the process of rebirth. That's my own understanding. Don't say Bhikkhu Bodhi said that the Buddhist texts say that the heart is the electrical power source and the brain is the cognitive processing unit. Okay, Richard?
What's the Pali word for heart secretion?
No. This is the word hadaya, which is actually related, etymologically, it's related to the English word heart. One could see this more clearly from the Sanskrit. The Sanskrit is difficult. Hridaya. So you could see from Hridaya to heart, they're both coming from the same Indo-Aryan, both from the same Indo-Aryan roots. Somebody in the, okay.
Is it possible to have an underlying tendency towards enlightenment? At certain moments in ordinary life, even before a world tremendous, most of the time I carried along passively by habits and breathing. But occasionally, a deeper kind of questioning can well up like a clearing in class, and I experience it like this: why am I here? What am I here for? And I say the questioning will have another quality of longing for wisdom, perhaps, or if, for example, in your case, early on there might be a yearning to follow the path. So with that, and of course it's conditioned. But how do you see it? Is it possible that we have, in addition to the underlying tendency to continue to suffer, another stream or possibility?
I didn't get the last part of the question.
I'm just wondering how you see it.
Okay, first, the word anuseya is used with a somewhat technical sense to mean it's always used as the underlying tendencies to these defilements. Sometimes 3 underlying tendencies are mentioned. The underlying tendency to craving, to aversion, to ignorance. Sometimes 7 are mentioned. You don't have to go through all of them. But it's always, the word anuseya is always used in reference to the defiled tendencies. But there's another word, interestingly, it's based on the same stem, the same original stem, that would indicate the yearning or aspiration for enlightenment, for liberation, for higher realization. This is a word This is a word in Pali, ajasaya, and in Sanskrit, ajasaya. You see, it's based on the same stem as the word anuseya, which saya means lying along, or lying. So what ajasaya gives the sense of, it has the prefix aji, and aji indicates something which is superior. So we might call this, translate it literally, as a superior inclination. Or they also translate it as an aspiration. So it's considered some kind of psychological force that gradually takes shape in a person, and then it expresses itself in, we call this a yearning, an aspiration, an inclination towards some higher level of realization or achievement, spiritual achievement. So in a way, the ajasaya is the positive counterpart to the anuseya. Anuseya is what keeps one flowing in the stream of birth and death. Ajasaya is the aspiration for transcendence.
The question is in 2 parts. So, I one hand we say there is no self.
Yeah.
When we look and there is no self, everything is the result of arising of conditions. So that is, I don't have a personal self, neither does Buddha has a personal self.
Yeah.
Buddha was a result of conditions that came together and gave rise to a phenomena called Buddha.
Right.
And on the other hand, we lay so much stress on things like my volitional actions are responsible for the state that I am in. Which is true in a relative sense, that is the case, but there is essentially no thing called my volitional action because me itself is not there.
Yeah.
So, isn't it better if we talk about everything in terms of phenomena that is happening rather than talking in terms of I who is either achieving something or not achieving something?
Yeah. This is a question?
Yes. I find the language of the text kind of contradictory.
It's not really contradictory, but it's just it's factual that on the one hand, the streams of consciousness are definitely individual in that there's distinctions. One individual stream of consciousness is not identical with the other. And so in a conventional sense, one could use the expression my or I in relation to these individual streams of consciousness, using these words as concessions to conventional usage without taking them to imply the real substantial existence of the self, a person that owns these things or that does these things. Okay, so on the one hand, there's some legitimacy in using these expressions as conventional usages to designate the individual streams of consciousness. On the other hand, you do have a valid point in that when we think about individual streams of consciousness, sometimes we picture them as though each one is flowing along in its own channel somewhat independently. But we also have to recognize that there is a constant interaction between streams of consciousness, so that ideas in your mind flow into my mind, ideas in my mind flow into your mind, things that one person decides will have an influence on decisions other people make decisions somebody else makes will have an influence on decisions that I might make. And so there's constant, my preferences can influence preferences of my friends, those who trust my judgment. If I look to somebody else's judgment, then their preferences will influence me. So there's a constant interaction, interdependency, I think Thich Nhat Hanh uses the expression interbeing between all phenomena. So we have to take both of these in balance, both the individuality of the streams of consciousness, that one is not identical or the same as the other, but also the fact that they are interwoven, interdependent, always interrelated.
Another question I had was, you talked about my underlying tendency that will lead to, you said three things, the intention, the plan, and the underlying tendency.
Yeah.
So when I look into...
But I didn't speak about your, or
yes.
I didn't even say my. I just said what one intends, what one plans.
So let's talk about the one. So the underlying tendency is very interesting in the sense, if I look deeper into my underlying tendency, this question has been puzzling me a lot, and maybe it's good time to ask. I cannot see any reason why I have certain tendencies and I don't, and the other person has certain and they don't. It seems like just like the nature of rock is to be solid, the nature of water is to be flowing, so is my nature and so is the nature of a different person. But we tend to kill ourselves in the process and we say, even just pursuing the path of spirituality, the ego comes in and says, what a nice tendency I have. Look, I'm going to the class in the morning, the monastery, what a nice work I'm doing. Then essentially, I couldn't have Daniel feels propriety. On the other hand, if somebody is going out in this morning trying to pickpocket, there is no difference between that person and me because that's what his natural tendency is. And it is mind-boggling to see that something that we consider so strongly, that is what I am doing and I am either good because of this or I am either bad because of this, has nothing to do with us. It is there as part of the assessment.
Yeah. Okay, this is very... Did you finish your comment?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so... the underlying we all have different underlying tendencies, as well as different ajasayas, different superior aspirations, higher aspirations. These all come from accumulations over many, many past lives. And so we build up our underlying tendencies through our physical actions, our verbal actions, and our thoughts. And so through, sometimes just like, some people will just come under the influence of other people, and then those people will induce them to behave in different ways, sometimes more corrupt ways, and so they will develop bad underlying tendencies. And so, as you're leaving the monastery, somebody might come over to you and say, "Hey, I have a scheme, you want to get rich?" You pretend you're an executive from Goldman Sachs. You go, I send you to Washington, so you go to the Treasury Department, you meet the Secretary of the Treasury, tell him you need a bailout. I'll wait outside in the car, and when you come out, we'll drive away and we split the funds between us. Okay, so when you hear this, then you can react in either of two ways. You hesitate for a moment, then you might think, this person is trying to persuade me to do something dishonest. I'm just coming out from the monastery, I've been listening to a wonderful lecture on dependent origination, telling us how we go from life to life based on our volitional actions. I better avoid this kind of activity. But you might pause and think, wow, $500 million? That's something else. Get me the plane ticket to Washington. Okay, so you make that decision, and then just in the flip of a switch, you've gone from a Dhamma student to a racketeer. And so now you're building up another tendency. And maybe it doesn't begin with something that's major like that, but sometimes the Buddha speaks about how both the bad tendencies and the good tendencies accumulate gradually. It's like when one puts a bucket under a leaking faucet, the faucet just drops out, the water comes out from the faucet, one drop, maybe every 30 seconds. But after a whole day, you get a bucket full of water. And so that's the way our good and bad deeds, our good and bad thoughts build up these tendencies within us. And then by training ourselves, then we can change the tendencies of the mind to move from the unwholesome direction to the wholesome direction. And so they're not completely... So then, okay, we perform these actions, we make the decisions, choices in this life, and these plant the seeds in our mind so that when we take birth, even at the time of birth, if one looks, psychologists have done this, they've studied infants at the time of birth, and they can see very different character traits, very different personalities in the newborn infant. And so it might seem, if we take a purely materialistic viewpoint, that life begins with birth, then we say it's just chance, or just a matter of genes, that this child is very bright, happy, cheerful, this child is destructive, he seems to be angry and destructive. But if we understand the workings of these tendencies, how they are transmitted from life to life, we can know that different tendencies are lodged within the minds of these infants, which they have created themselves through their choices and past lives. Okay, maybe if there's any further questions, please take the microphone.
Thank you. I hope this isn't way off topic. Is there any, in the literature, do we find these concepts apply to general cosmology at any point as opposed to the human condition?
To general cosmology and
planets, galaxies.
Of course, the text speaks.
There's no first cause.
Yeah, the text, they speak about formation of world systems, dissolution of world systems, but of course things like talk about streams of consciousness, underlying tendencies, karmic volitional formations, don't apply to physical phenomena, but to living beings.
Explain in detail the actuality, the inerrancy, the invariability, and the specific conditionality on page 354. I understand the actuality is that when conditions are sufficient, that a reason phenomenon is bound to occur. Is that right? And how about with the rest three?
I know that there's explanations in the commentaries. I don't know if I could remember them. Okay, the first one, actuality, says when the conditions are all assembled, then the dependently originated phenomena will arise. That's actuality, tattva. The second one is inerrancy, is that what it is?
354.
Yeah, that's inerrancy, vitattva. That's explained when the conditions are all assembled and there is no non-arising of the dependent phenomena, even for a moment. Then invariability, it says that one phenomena doesn't arise with another phenomena's conditions. And then specific conditionality means that each phenomena that arises has its own specific conditions. But that is a commentarial way of finding differences when maybe there were no differences originally intended. Perhaps they were the words intended almost synonymously. I see there's a note there. You left us a note?
I actually have to follow with the third one because the dependent origination is expressed usually in 12 weeks, but sometimes it's expressed in like 5 weeks or 7 weeks.
Yeah.
When this is missing, it's difficult to express the third term.
Yeah. Yeah, that is so. So in that way, the commentarial explanation seems a little bit inapplicable to that case. But sometimes we have different conditions given, sometimes the sequence of conditions is changed. Like in the last passage that I took, consciousness here is shown not to arise from volitional formation, but from the I and form. But in the usual sequence, the I comes later than consciousness. But here, the I comes before consciousness. So there is variation in the way the conditions are presented. Anyata. I would just take this very much as a synonym for the fact that it always occurs regularly, dependably in the sequence of conditions. Don't try to push too technical a meaning into it. Okay, we'll take one more question. The woman behind you. Please.
As far as the practicality of potential origination, so that we start to really, wire our minds to start to see this process happening. So understanding everything from the past is coming into the present based on the conditions, the present moment is based on all these conditions, and you're creating the future conditions.
Exactly.
So this is depending on origination to see this process constantly in our lives.
Exactly, yeah.
So focusing on that. And then in the sequence of it, the contact and the feeling happens so fast, because feeling is kind of conditioned already.
Yeah.
So it happens so fast, so at the craving point is where the process is to see that, happening at the predicate.
Yeah, it's at the point actually where feeling gives rise to craving, or sometimes craving will arise just spontaneously through the feeling, but then one has to prevent the craving from turning into clinging.
That point right there is really the practice.
That is the central point in the Buddha's practice, especially the practice of mindfulness and insight meditation. Okay, so that was very well expressed. Just for the recording, I just want to repeat what you said, that dependent origination shows us that how our present situation originates from our past conditions, the conditions we created in past life, which bring us into the present. And it also shows us how, by changing the direction of our lives, our volitions, our intentions in the present, we can shape our future, turn it into a different direction. Okay, we will come to an end now, and then we have a class next week. Next week is August 1st, correct? So next week, I'll take the Four Noble Truths and Nibbana. Last week, I think I said I was going to finish the section on dependent origination today, and then take the section on Four Noble Truths and Nibbana. This is why it's always best to make up schedules. Okay, we end with the sharing of the merit. Akasata bhumata deva naga mahitiha punyantam anumoditva siram rakantu sasanam. Akasata bhumata deva naga mahitiha punyantam anumoditva siram rakantu desanam. Akasata bhumata deva naga mahitiha punyantam anumoditva siram rakantu mantaram. Etavatatam hei sampadam punya sampadam sabbe devanumodantu sabba sampati siddhya. Etavatatam hei sampadam punya sampadam sabbe bhutanumodantu sabba sampati siddhya. Etavatatam hei Sampadang Punya Sampadang Sabbe Satanumodantu Sabba Sampati Siddhya Baba Rupadaya Abhijitato Ekantare Satakaya Upapana Rupya Rupicha Asanya Sanino Dukha Pamosantu Pusantu Vibhutim